the history of money. By the end of this, you will learn a lot of the reasons why I say the things that I do. You will understand why I maybe get a little bit passionate and excited when I talk about Bitcoin, maybe why I think Bitcoin is so cool. And whilst I haven't put all my savings into Bitcoin 100%, I think Bitcoin gets a lot of bad press. I think Bitcoin is misrepresented a lot. Bitcoin's intentions are actually really pure and good. The reason why it was started was as a hedge to inflation because of rampant money printing. You will see what I mean, and you will have a lot more understanding into the background of why Bitcoin was created by the end of this webinar. So, without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump straight in. Here we are. So, first of all, I just have to do my due diligence, and that is to say that this is not financial advice. So, I wouldn't like anybody to come away from tonight and think that, oh, I should use the basis of this webinar as the structure for my whole investing portfolio. No, I wouldn't suggest that at all. What I would say is using it as an adjunct or an aid to your understanding so that you can formulate the basis for a sound theory of investment principles. As I say, that is the best way to use this information, not as a whole thesis in itself. Everybody's journey or pathway into investing is totally different from the next person, and yours will be different from mine, and mine will be different from yours, and that's totally fine. But the more information we have, the better. Who would dispute that? Let's go. A quote: "Every man takes the limits of his own vision to be the limits of the world." This was me before I started learning about money. I thought that my life was teeth. There'll be some people in the audience who were like me, perhaps, or they're fascinated with teeth. Honestly, I was the most dedicated dentist. That was all there was to my life. And whilst I still am a dedicated dentist, I'm still very passionate about dentistry. I now realize that there's more to life than teeth, and we have to insure ourselves against some of the bad actors and the characters who want to take away our wealth. And they take advantage of our lack of knowledge. They do it all the time. The government has basically worked out a way of taxing us through inflation. That's why the taxes didn't go up too much. The Chancellor's budget just gone by. Yet spending was massive. Where did that money come from? You'll soon find out. You'll see. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is going to talk about the history of money. Now, a lot of you may know this. A lot of you may not know this. It was actually originally created in Mesopotamia, way back. We're talking about 3000 BC, with some bright spark put two and two together and thought, actually, it would be nice to have a common means of transaction rather than exchanging for goods that we might necessarily want. So if I was to trade 10 logs of timber for one goat, what about if I didn't want a goat? Or what about if I didn't want any timber? There needed to be some commonality, some means of transaction. But there also was other reasons why it was beneficial to society. Accepted as a universal means of exchange, it's a status symbol. Who doesn't like to flash the cash? People never change. You know, we still think like that thousands of years later. Absolutely insane. Unites a society and it maintains the status quo. Uniting a society is super important. There has to be some uniformness. There has to be some cohesiveness. There has to be some glue that holds us all together. And that is why money is cohesive to our society, and it still is to this day. Anyway, the fall of the Roman Empire. The mighty Roman Empire, what has this got to do with money, you might ask? Actually, the fall of the Roman Empire was linked to inflation of its currency, a very, very, very early form of inflation. And you will see what I mean in just a second. So let's go way back once more. Gold and silver, they were the original form of money, the means of transaction. Why did everybody like gold and silver? Simple answer, just because they were so beautiful. That was the main reason why. It was agreed. There was a consensus amongst people that they had value. They don't actually have many purposes. What can you use gold for? What can you use silver for? The industrial purposes, the everyday purposes of those things are actually not that commonplace, or there's not that many of them. There's not much of a multitude of their uses. Even back then, way back in the day, we basically, one day there was consensus among society that there was gold and silver was beautiful, and they became currency. Now, the Romans knew this. Even in Roman times, they knew that silver was valuable. They knew that they had to somehow make the silver into a token so that it could be useful. And that's how the Roman denarius was born. This first silver coin that was the standard of how they paid their soldiers. Each soldier in the legion got a denarius a day. Really simple. Really, really, really simple. If you were higher up the ranks, you got more denarius. Really, really, really simple. Okay. The denarius started out 97% silver. It was as pure as they could make it. It was pure silver. It was a coin. The agreed upon value of the denarius was slightly higher than the weight of silver in the coin, which was very clever, because then that meant that there was no incentive for people to go ahead and melt the coins down and just turn them into chunks of silver. It also meant it was more likely that people wouldn't go further astray to other countries and spend their money, because they knew that that quantity of silver, the value of that, was worth way more in the Roman Empire. So it was very savvy. Plus, they can make a tidy profit. So they weren't behind the door about thinking about themselves either. But that was in there too. So as time went on, 97% silver, that was good. The empire was flourishing. Things were progressing nicely. 79 AD, does anyone know what happened that year? Any history buffs out there? It was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which caused destruction, which caused there to be molten lava everywhere, and the city beside Vesuvius. And of course, what that meant was that there was a lot of refugees. There was a lot of people who had to get off that island all at once. The towns that surrounded Vesuvius, that little island that it was on. And because of that, all those people, they had to rush off that island. They rushed to the mainland. They had a situation in which there was lots of people who were displaced and they had no home. They had nowhere to go. The government had to step in. But of course, there was 50,000 people who lived in the towns and cities surrounding Vesuvius. 50,000 people. Lots of them died, but lots of them were now without a home. They were homeless. They needed support. The government had to step in. And what did the government do? It took its silver. It ran out of silver, basically. It ran out of funds to maintain this. It had so many other obligations. It had to run the empire. It had to pay the soldiers. It had this huge burgeoning empire. It needed more silver, but it didn't know where it was going to get from, because they didn't have unlimited resources after all. So what they did was they took their coin, they subtly devalued it, and they took some of the silver out of the coin. They used the excess silver. To pay for remedial work, to pay for reparations, to pay for these people to have a home. The government stepped in and gave them aid. Has anybody heard of the saying, circuses and bread? Circuses and bread to keep the population happy. This is where it came from. The emperors of the time put on circuses and they give away bread to quell unrest within the population, to quell unrest amongst these people whilst they were rebuilding. It's very interesting. That's where that came from. So anyway, that happened. And basically this set in motion a slippery slope in which people would basically devalue the currency more and more of time by removing the silver content. So the coins, once they were bright and silvery and they were beautiful, with time they became grey, they lost their luster, they changed. And this happened over a period of many, many years. So at first it was very slow. 107 AD, there was 93% silver in a Roman denarius. By 193 AD, there was 78.5. So it took a long time. It took a long, long time. But as time went on, it began to increase more exponentially as the government ran out of money. And also, as well as that, as rampant inflation took over. So because they had so much less silver, they had to create ever more of these coins to compromise. This culminated in 250 AD with the creation of the Antenarius, which is a double denarius coin, but it only had 50% of the silver. And this was the tipping point, okay? To add insult to injury, the Roman legion, they kicked off. The whole country went into civil war. Things went downhill from there. The empire, it lasted about another 150 years after that. And this all escalated. People don't know this. This all escalated because they devalued their currency. They removed the silver content from the denarius. And the Roman legion, the soldiers in there, they thought this was insulting. They put their lives on the line every day, and it began to get less and less money. They replaced the denarius with, it became 3% silver and 97% copper towards the end. It was so grey and yellow, it was pretty much copper. There wasn't even any, they weren't even trying to disguise it. The only people that got paid gold that fought for the Roman army were the mercenaries. They were the mercenaries, the people that they brought in from other countries to fight for the Roman legion. They got paid in pure gold, as if it couldn't get any more insulting for the Roman legion. Now, you might ask, what has the Roman legion got to do with modern finance? But people don't change. Psychology doesn't change. You will see the parallels in just a moment. So there's two lessons in this story. We can be culturally indoctrinated by the powers that be to ascribe value to anything. Think about gold and silver. They're not actually really that useful to us. What can we use gold in? What can we use silver in? Apart from gold has pretty much got two uses. It's got a use as a semiconductor. Apparently its electronic resistance is very low. You can use it in satellites. So I'm told. NASA use it in their satellites. One more familiar to us is that we can use it in dental crowns. Dental crowns. Gold is the best. Gold is gold. Gold is the dentistry of old. The most superior crowns were made from gold. 60% gold, of course, as we all know. But does its whole value really derive from those two uses? Probably not. If you think about it, gold is very valuable and it doesn't have that many use cases. What makes up the difference? What makes up the disparity between those two things? The difference between those two things is its beauty, its luster. It doesn't tarnish. It looks beautiful. We like it. There's a consensus amongst other people that it's worth something, and this is why it is. So you have to deconstruct. Why do we think anything is value? It's mainly because others agree that it has value. No matter if you've got the most useful thing in the world, if no one else will buy it from you unless they also believe that it's useful to them, or they also have the perception of value. And value, by the way, is an illusion. Psychology is an illusion. Think about us as human beings. Think about how we think. Think about how easily we are to have the wool pulled over our eyes on occasion. Value is just a manifestation of psychology. Psychology is value. Value is money. Psychology is money, if you think about it. Inflation can destabilize societies is the second lesson we can take from that. And you will see in just a moment why that is so relevant to us nowadays, given the state of the world's debt and given the state of our economy. Has this happened elsewhere? We need some more contemporaneous examples, don't we, really? We can't just compare ourselves to the Roman era. We can't say that it's exactly the same as the age we live in right now. The age we live in right now is, whilst we're still people, the age we live in right now is different. This has happened more recently in lots of other countries. Inflation is devalued, and currency has been devalued, and inflation has taken over. Weimar Republic, Germany's interwar era. We all know what happened after that. We all know who they put in charge after that because of civil unrest. We don't need to tell that story again. Yugoslavia in the 1990s, Zimbabwe. We've got a really interesting Zimbabwean note that you will see at the end of this lecture. You will see just quite how much hyperinflation kicked in that country. And a more obscure one, actually, the Yuan dynasty in China. It was a state, the Mongols on their conquest of China, they created the Yuan dynasty. And basically, this was the first time where currency, so paper money, was widely circulated. And the Yuan dynasty, the guys who were in charge, they printed a lot of money because they thought that this was the only way that they could solve their debts. They didn't realize what this would do to the economy. And it's a very nice case study of what can happen when you print too much paper money, not just money that we just spoke about earlier, physical money, and debasing a currency by removing the silver content. Long story short, supply and demand, the more supply there is, the less, then obviously that will mean that whatever that asset is, it will be devalued. And that applies to currency as well. It's the same principle, but we're just applying it to money and currency. So, the history of paper money, gold is the one true money, but gold is, of course, very impractical to carry. You can't just go around lugging about a kilogram of gold. That's pretty impractical. It's a big old weighty thing, you know? Wouldn't it be far more simple if I had a piece of paper that said on it that I owe you this particular value or amount of gold, and I could give that to others and we could transact with that? Now you're beginning to think along the same lines as people who first issued paper money. It was just through time that this initial chivalrous concept that became distorted and became completely, well, it just suits the ends of a few and not really the population. But you'll see what I mean in just a second by that. Gold is the one true money, impractical to carry, therefore notes created, issued by the Chinese in medieval times. Interestingly, the very first notes that were created were IOUs for items that were offloaded at Chinese docks. You would go to the warehouse, you would put in 100 tons a kilo of timber. You would have a piece of paper that says, in this warehouse, there is 100 tons of timber, and you would carry that piece of paper around with you, and you would give it to someone else, and they would buy it and they would sell it from you. That's where paper money came from. It just so happens that actual paper money is the same concept except applied to gold in a central bank. So traditionally, paper money is an IOU for a quantity of gold in a bank. That's all it is. But we'll come on to that in just a second. The first permanent banknotes were created by the Bank of England. They were created because the Bank of England needed a way to create capital so that they could fight the French. Bank of England created in 1694. £1. This is where the pound comes from. For anyone who doesn't know this, £1, pound sign, equals £1, as in libs, pounds of gold. That was why it was called the pound originally. Think about, you wouldn't get anywhere near a pound for a pound of gold for a pound these days. It's much more than that. It's more like 1800 for a kilogram, I believe, off the top of my head. So it's miles off. It's miles off. And that's how much it's been devalued with time, which is absolutely crazy. And it only really goes one way. It never really gets more valuable. So we've talked about central banks. We talk about the Bank of England. This is another story which is going to give you insight into the corruption that is rampant in the government and their creation of money, the creation of the Federal Reserve. This is a story that is too strange to be true, but it is true as a matter of fact. Read The Creature from Jekyll Island if you don't believe me. This is how America's central bank was created. The definition of a central bank, by the way, is a bank that can print currency. The rights of that currency to be created are absolved into one organization, and it holds this power. No other bank can do this. That's what a central bank is. So naturally, you would presume they're owned by the government. Oh, no, not the Federal Reserve in America, not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is America's central bank, as I said earlier. If we rewind back in history to the 1800s, there was actually many banks throughout the country. And each one of those banks independently issued their own notes. And each one of it, they had to be backed by gold by law. So those notes that were independently issued by every single bank, they were transacted in different states. You could go to the Bank of Wyoming, you would have the Wyoming banknotes, the Bank of Idaho, anywhere you like. And there would be all these individual banks, these private businesses that would issue their own notes. But what happened when those banks, as nascent businesses sometimes do, what happens when they go bust? People lose their money. There's banking crisis. People run to the bank. They withdraw all their money. There's panic that sets in. And this was a recurring problem throughout the America in the 1800s. There would be lots of banks that would go bust. People would lose all their money. Other people would run to the bank and panic withdraw all their money. There would be stampedes of people. There'd be deaths. There'd be chaos every single time word spread that a bank was going under. Sometimes the bank wasn't even going under. Its competitors would circulate rumors that it was. And as soon as everyone withdrew their money, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The bank would go under. All right. So the fledgling economy of America needed an answer. What used to happen was private individuals used to step in and remunerate the banks, used to give them money so that they could stay afloat. But of course, you can't have power divested to a group of wealthy people to control these banks. There needs to be a central authority over which it's too haphazard a way to run a country effectively. And that was the argument of the people who created the Federal Reserve. So if anybody's heard of John D. Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, those sorts of individuals, everybody will know that they're one of the original monopolies. They're large industrialists from the 1800s. They weren't necessarily good guys. They weren't necessarily people that you want to associate with, but they were absolutely ruthless businessmen. They basically they met on Jekyll Island, and they formulated a plan to create a central bank. They took their plan. It was written into law in 1913 in Washington, D.C. by the American government. Because it was their idea, they played hardball with the wealth. They were wealthier than the American government. These people that put it together, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, people of that ilk. J.P. Morgan was there as well. He was the ringleader. Those people, because they had so much power, they had so much influence, they said they wanted to be the private owners of the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, the one bank that can print money, is owned by private individuals. Okay? There's 8 of them. No one knows who these people are. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, their descendants, JP Morgan, all of those people, their descendants. And the bank, those 8 shareholders, every time that bank's balance sheet goes up, obviously they get dividends because they're shareholders. And what makes the balance go up? You guessed it, when they print money. How crazy is that? It's almost too strange to be true. It's almost too ridiculous to be true. If you don't believe me, read the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, and you will see now how America, people who run the Federal Reserve, the people who run that bank, it's in their interests to print and create money, because those people, they're going to be corrupted eventually. Unless they're saints, unless they're sages, they're never going to hold their resolve in that amount of wealth. There's a reason they got to where they are. It's by being ruthless. Who ultimate power corrupts ultimately. You know, it's too hard for me to believe that they use that. Every single one of those people on that board uses that power responsibly. And as well as that, what we have to remember is, because most assets around the world are traded in dollars, every time there's inflation in dollars, prices for oil goes up, and we have to pay more for oil, and basically it pushes the price up of pretty much every single thing in the globe. So this is something that we have to be super conscious of. Anytime there's inflation in America, because America is the world's reserve currency, because American dollar, most things are traded internationally in American dollars, this affects us. This doesn't just affect Americans. This is crazy, okay? This is crazy. So those people in that government, as soon as they print more money, they stand to gain from it. They stand to gain from it effectively, because it's owned by private individuals. To my knowledge, there's no other central bank that's owned by private individuals apart from the Federal Reserve. The Bank of England is owned by the British government, as it should be. At least they're accountable. At least they're not anonymous, you know? But when I read that, it changed my world. Anyway, on to the next slide. What is money? Money is a unit of measure. We have to have a way of measuring our wealth that others accept. A medium of exchange. We can go to the shop, we can use it, we can trade it for things. A store of wealth. When we work hard, when we come home from a big day at work, how do we measure how do we measure our success? How do we measure our education? How do we measure how much effort that we put in? It's measured by money, of course. But revelation, earth-shattering moment, money does not always equal currency. We use the words interchangeably, but money does not always equal currency. Currency is just legal tender that's issued by a third party, which may or may not be equivalent to money. The strictest sense, the only real thing that's money is gold. Currency, because it's debased, because it's not exchanged in any fixed quantity for gold, because it's exchanged in any fixed quantity for gold, for any asset, what that means is that currency, as I say, currency doesn't always equal money, but money can always equal currency. So those paper notes, those pieces of paper that we have in our wallets, in our bank account, there is no basis to that. These are just tokens that are issued by a third party that we've been indoctrinated to believe are worth something. Pegged currency began with the creation of the first note by the Bank of England. When we were talking about how £1 equaled one pound in value, equaled £1 in weight, that was what pegged currency was. Pegged currency was a thing for many, many, many years. That was the only basis through which society can run. It makes sense. It totally makes sense. If you can go to the bank and exchange a piece of paper for a fixed quantity of gold, that's the whole point. The whole point is that we can use this to acquire, we can exchange this for gold. We can exchange this for something that's actually considered valuable. It's money. Okay, that is the whole point. So as I say, it began with the creation of the first note in the Bank of England. That was the first long-term fixed paper currency that there was, created by the Bank of England in 1694. A fixed amount of currency equal a fixed amount of gold. This worked well, but what if a country needed more gold to make more currency for economic growth? What if a country needed more money, but they didn't have the means to procure more gold? As the world's population got bigger and bigger, gold got less common. This became an issue for governments, but particularly when they had vast outlays. And it was times of strife that actually pushed them to have unpegged currencies. Unpegged currencies are something that we're going to talk about in a minute. So like I say, just to go into more detail about peg currency, what the problem is with peg currency, a lot of conflicts throughout history have been driven by the fact that man needs more gold. Man needs more gold to create more currency to solve their problems. I don't know if many people know this, but the American Indian Wars, the Battle of Bighorn in 1875, does anyone know why that happened? Does anyone know why the American army infringed or perpetrated upon the American natives' land? They wanted gold. They wanted gold in the Black Mountains. The Black Mountains were an Indian sacred burial site. The American government needed gold because the economy was in trouble. There wasn't enough money in the economy to restart it. It was going through a rough period. There was no growth. There was deflation. There was all of these things, and they needed to restart the American economy. Nowadays, they can just print more money, just like what they did in coronavirus. If they need more money, they can just print it. They can just create it. But back then, they needed more gold so that they could print more money. They sent their army to the Black Mountains to kick the Indians off. The Battle of Bighorn and Custer's last stand, that was his folly, his attempt to take on way too many of the Native Americans. And it didn't go so well, and that was why General Custer died. And it wasn't for many years that they were able to actually get their hands on that gold that was in the Black Mountains. But this was the whole reason for that conflict, because America's government needed more gold. Interesting. Also, as well as that, not many people know this as well, but in 1929, the Great Depression, we've all heard of that. 1933, the government, again, it was in trouble. The Great Depression, the economy was in lots of strife. There were people that were very poor, people that didn't have much wealth, people that had lost all their wealth. There was not much money to go around. What did the American government do? It repossessed the gold of its own citizens. Look this up. It sounds nuts. This actually happened. Franklin D. Roosevelt said that anybody who owns over $100 worth of gold legally had to go to a bank, to their local central bank, or to any local body or entity that was deemed appropriate by the government that they could give their gold to. They had to give it to them. They would be paid in dollars. They would be paid the quantity of gold that they give them. So at that time, it was $20 for an ounce. So they got their dues. Okay, they didn't have their gold, but they got some dollars. What did he do as soon as he acquired all that gold? What did he do? He doubled the value of gold in dollar terms. So he now said, actually, all those dollars I gave you, they're now worth half as much. Okay, and I have all the gold, and it's worth $40 now, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And he used that gold. He sold that gold back to the people so that he could create money, so that he could alleviate the country from poverty. Okay, he had the right intentions at hand, but could you imagine that happening nowadays? It's completely unheard of. But you know what? It only needs to happen once for us to lose our gold. And that's what happened to those people in 1933. Very famous incident. It's been called the most un-American thing that happened in American history. Look this all up. This happened. It all happened in times of strife. What's the world in at the minute? A time of strife. How is it going to react? Hopefully they won't take all our gold. I don't think they'll go that far. But basically things that happen that are unprecedented around about those times. And these are the things that people need to be aware of. They need to understand that actually their wealth and what they own, it's not as stable as you might perceive it to be. It's not as stable as you might perceive it to be. And there's been many times in the past where governments have abused their power and taken our wealth from us so that they can, to suit their own agenda. But anyway, two incredible events, two crazy things. This is what pegged money necessitated. So like I say, yeah, the pegged money, it wasn't without its problems. Okay, it definitely wasn't without its problems, but at least we had a reasonable means that we could exchange our wealth for. We could exchange our wealth for a fixed value of gold. But yeah, two very famous incidents, definitely something to look up. Unpegged currency, here we go. Here's what we all know and love. Fiat currency. Well, I don't know about love, but we certainly know about it anyway. This one in your wallet right now. If you look at your wallet, you got a £10 note in there. That's what this is. It's unpegged currency, i.e. fiat currency. But what does that mean? Britain and Germany unpegged their currency from 1914, again in times of strife, to fight each other in the war. They needed more gold, but they couldn't procure it. Most of their resources were directed towards building up their army. They needed more money. Where were they going to get it from? They decided, as a temporary measure, inverted commas temporary, that they would now it would now be the case that £1 of British currency would not buy you £1 of gold. That was in 1914. But because the populace, because all of us had been so indoctrinated by that point to believe that the pound, the British pound, had value, because let's remember it had been around for about 300 years at this point. Let's remember that we had been indoctrinated over all that time to just transact it in everyday life. So you know what changed? The fact that it was pegged changed. Nobody even really batted an eyelid. Most people didn't even know what that meant. They could still go about their daily lives. They could still go about spending their money as they did before. It made no difference to them, but it made all the difference to the government, who now had much more currency to fight Germany in the war. And they needed a lot of currency because wars are expensive, of course. Then something came along called the Bretton Woods Agreement. So in 1944, when the Allies realized that it was pretty much certain that they were going to beat Germany in the world, they decided that they needed a universal means to back their currencies because they were all scared of hyperinflation coming out of the war. One of the world's currencies that was still pegged was the American dollar. You could still exchange 40 American dollars for an ounce of gold. It was still pegged. Every currency, lots of currencies who signed up to the Bretton Woods Agreement, they agreed that a certain value of their currency would be worth a certain value of dollars. So therefore, indirectly, their money was backed by American gold. This is why American dollars got to be the reserve currency of the world, because at the time, they were the only currency that was backed by gold. So it was a good power play by FDR in 1933. You can't knock that. He took the gold. He took so much gold that he could basically underpin the world's economies because America had such vast gold reserves. How insane is that? That was all well and good until 1971. Richard Nixon needs cash to fight the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was an atrocious war, if anybody knows much about it. It was a war of attrition. They poured so much money at that. They were never going to win. Richard Nixon, in a last roll of the dice, he unpegged his own currency, the dollar, from gold. Therefore, the Bretton Woods Agreement, whilst it was never formally eradicated, it basically became ineffective. It basically became the whole thing that underpinned it, the whole reason why they did it in the first place, disappeared overnight. Richard Nixon didn't consult anybody, by the way. He just did this. So now, because our currencies and the world's economy is underpinned by the dollar, as soon as there's inflation in the dollar, you guessed it, we all pay way more money. We all pay, daily goods, anything that we buy in the shop, because most of it hinges on the price of oil. As soon as that happens, boom, we all pay more. So we are all so susceptible to American inflation. We are all so susceptible to American inflation. And this is something that we have to be super wary of. Super wary of. Currency backed by thin air. It's literally just backed by the fact that we trust the American government. That's all that it's backed by. As soon as we have any reason to doubt that trust, things can get a little shaky. Things go out the window. Fiat currency is born, a currency that is effectively backed by trust. Double-digit inflation in the US for several years afterwards. Here we go. Let's break it down once more. Money versus currency. What we use in the day-to-day life, we actually shouldn't technically call that money. What we should call it is currency, because if it was money, the definition of money, it has these 6 things over here. These are the 6 things that constitute money. But look at this. There's one crucial difference right here. It's a store of wealth. And that's why if you buy gold or silver, look at gold, look at the price of gold and silver over a long enough time. It goes bottom left to top right. What that means is that it goes up. It's literally the yardstick by what they use to measure inflation. It's literally the yardstick by what they use to measure inflation. So as soon as you accept that there's going to be more inflation, there's going to be more money printing, then you accept as well that the price of money, the price of gold is likely to go up. So it's an interesting basis for some investment in that, not just in gold, but in other assets too. You will see, as soon as you accept that there's going to be more money printing, and as well as that, you accept that the population of the world is going to go up, driving demand for those assets, then those two philosophies in themselves are already two sound philosophies that you can use to make an investment portfolio. But you don't have to agree with me. But personally, having read what I've read, there is quite a lot of people out there who think the same way as me, and they use these two interesting key concepts to begin thinking about how they can spread their risk and not just hold all the currency in cash, because that's so important. And the day I learned this was the day it completely flipped on its head for me, how important it is to not just leave a big pile of cash in a bank account, and to think about how you can spread it across other things that are inherently programmed to go up in cash value, which is crazy. Cool. So what is inflation? We talked about inflation, but we haven't actually explained what that is very well just yet. Inflation is the decline in buying power of a currency. So for every dollar you have, you can buy less, inverted commas, stuff with it every year. It's just a comparison of the strength of that currency to how many items, to how many things that you can buy on a day-to-day basis. The more currency there is, whilst the amount of stuff stays the same, replace stuff with gold, replace stuff with silver, replace stuff with anything that comes in a finite quantity. The more this stays the same means the ratio of currency to stuff increases. Therefore, the more currency there is, the less the currency is worth. Therefore, the more currency it takes for us to exchange for the same value, the same quantity of whatever it is we're purchasing. And that's why, as I say, gold is a far cry from £1 to £1. You know, it's miles off that. It is miles off that. And that gives you an idea of just how much this has happened over the years. Here we go. Here's an interesting graph. This is the price, the quantity, the dollar purchasing power versus if you compare its pre-1933 value before FDR had his way with it. If you let that be 100% and you compare its purchasing power through time to that original 100%, so 100% being $20 for 1 ounce of gold, effectively, you can see around about 1933, look what happens here. It pretty much halves. Then it chugs along till we get to the 1970s, and then boom. Because as we know, what did Richard Nixon do in the 1970s, 1971s? He unpegged their currency, okay? And you can see the price of gold goes whoosh like that. And it's still going. This trend still continues. Now, this is all well and good. What is this? How does this affect me? Why is this important? You might be asking. It's important because the government needs to create more money to fund its debt. And the governments have been borrowing money to fund their spending for many, many years. And that money, that currency that they need to pay their debt back, that has to come from somewhere. And where does it come from? It comes from a few things, but we'll get into that later. But one of the main things they do is money printing, which we spoke about a minute ago. No one wants the government to bring in austerity measures. So that debt, that money that they used, that currency that they borrowed in however long ago to fight whatever war, it just effectively accumulates time over time over time over time. Because we're just going to vote for the person who's more likely to help us. We're just going to vote for the person who effectively kicks the can down the road over a long enough period of time, or at least that's how the majority of the country vote as well. An election manifesto that says something like, I'm going to sort out the debt of the country doesn't quite read as well as, I'm going to plow thousands into this public project, whatever, thousands, millions into this public project. And that is the reason why this perpetuates in most countries. Total government debt versus GDP of some developed countries. You can see this is only really going one way. This is shooting up. This is up over time. Italy is right up here at the very top. So their gross domestic product, the total value of their goods and services created every year, they actually owe more than what they create every year in terms of debt. They're in a precarious situation because, as we know, the more debt you have, the more debt repayments you have, and the more, it's like two hands around your neck. You get choked and choked and choked. You got less money to spend on the things that you need. And that is why the whole process continues. That is why countries that have more debt, there's less public spending, and effectively they get choked through time. So this is not something that can continue indefinitely. Here we are, the UK, the red line. We can see we were at about 85%. And by the way, this is only 2019. No one even knew what coronavirus was by the time this graph was made. So if we had an updated graph, it's going to be whoosh up there like that. There's only one thing that's done for our debt, and that's increased it 100%. So that puts everything into perspective a lot more, and it makes everything even more rather worrying still. But again, you might be asking, what does government debt have to do with me, have to do with you, have to do with any of us? You'll find out shortly. So remember, this debt, it's so vast. It's so vast. The government has to spend a certain proportion of its intake on servicing that debt, on interest repayments, on anything that they owe, and interest repayments and paying back the debt itself. So as the debt grows, which it inevitably does, they pay more interest, they pay more of the debt repayments back themselves, and you can see how it's a snowball effect, and this happens with time. 4 ways a government can reduce its debt. These are the 4 ways. There's only 4 ways it can do it. So they have to take their pick from these 4 ways. And when we understand these 4 ways, we understand their predicament so much more, and our predicament too. 4 ways a government can reduce its debt: increase taxes, remove money from the economy. But what happens when you remove money from the economy? Someone who owns a business is paying more taxes. They have less money to spend. They can take on less staff. Therefore, it's got a negative effect on the economy because they have less money available to them to spend. Default/reduce debts. Banks, they can go to the banks and they can say, listen, our debt's unmanageable. We need less debt. How can we restructure it? But of course, as soon as you do that to the banks, then when they lend to you in future, they'll charge you higher interest rates. So therefore, that is also not good for the country, because it means that there is less capital that the government can procure to spend on the nation, on the economy, because again, by the sheer fact that they've reduced their debts in the short term, they're going to be paying more in the long run when they inevitably have to repay that back. Plus, as well as that, the banks get super shaky with consumer debts, and they begin to any outstanding payments, they begin to chase those up. And again, it means that there's less credit, there's less money available to the general populace and to the government as well. So they hate to do that too. They hate to do it too. It's deflationary, which means that your money becomes worth more over time, really weirdly. But we'll come into that in just a second. However, decrease spending, they can do that too. But if they're not paying for the workers for any particular government body, if they're hiring less, then again there's less money in the economy. It's not good for the economy effectively to do that, to decrease their spending. So what they're really tempted to do is increase their spending, which conversely they can actually manipulate this to increase their debt. Because all of a sudden, let's say if they owe, we'll use some nice round numbers that everybody can relate to. Let's say they owe $10 million or £10 million. What about if they print 20 million? Okay, they can pay their 10 million off and still have 10 million left over. Okay, because they make the rules. No one else does. They make the rules. They're the government. Okay, but obviously now, where there was once 10 million, there's now 20 million, and you can see how this effect continues. You can see how it can build up. It's not just as simple as that, but that's pretty much the basic premise of it. And certainly, the carrot is dangling right there for the government to do this. They're really, really tempted to do this because it's a really easy way out. And in the short term, the country becomes more affluent because there's more money circling around. Let's be honest, we're all way more likely to get out of our bed if we think that we can earn a good wage, earn a good living. There's more jobs, there's more capital floating around. And this is why it's a option that they prefer the most, or they're very keen to utilize. They're certainly very keen to utilize. So in addition to that, there's actually only 2 ways that a government can create capital. These are the 4 ways that it can manage its debt, but there's only 2 ways that it can obtain capital. One is taxation, which, as we know, they're less keen to do because that's not so good for the country, at least beyond certain thresholds that it is. And especially when they think a tax is as high as it can realistically be, then they are definitely way less keen to do that. Or the other option is debt monetization. This is actually how they get their paws on the money. Debt monetization is when the government creates bonds out of thin air. If anybody is confused what a bond is effectively an IOU. So it's when the government says, I'm going to pay you if you buy this bond from me now, I'm going to pay you back X number of money over a certain number of years, and when we get to the end of that period of time, I'll give you the full face value of the bond back. So that's the bond's maturity date, and the rate at which they pay over all those years, that's the coupon rate. So that's something else entirely. So effectively, bonds are interest is bonds. So, as I say, a bond is an IOU. So the government doesn't actually just get awarded money out of thin air. It has to issue bonds, and then the central bank will buy these bonds. So the Bank of England will buy these bonds, and the money will go into the government's coffers. Okay, but they still owe that money. They still owe that money to the Bank of England, and obviously with that debt, there comes the servicing fees as well. It sells these bonds in the bond market to both commercial enterprises and central banks. When central banks buy these, they create money out of thin air to do this. Thin air. The more that they do this, the more money that's created out of thin air, the more our money that's in our bank accounts becomes worthless with time. So effectively, they've worked out how they can tax us without tax us while also increasing the rate at which money is spent in the economy. This is known as quantitative easing. Central banks, only banks that can create money, as we said before, they've got two main levers through which they can affect the economy. The first one is interest rates, and the second one is quantitative easing that we spoke about before. Inflate assets use printed money to make individuals appear wealthier and keeping them creditworthy so that banks will lend them and keep the economy going. What does that mean? The more money that's in the economy, the more money that's floating around, the more likely we are to buy houses, the more likely we are to buy stocks, the more likely we are to buy gold. Therefore, the price of those assets go up. The more assets we have and the more valuable we are, the more valuable they appear, then the more we are creditworthy. The more creditworthy we are, the bigger loans that we can take out. The more loans that we take out, the more we can spend. And so the cycle continues and continues and continues. And this is the inflationary phase. This is the inflationary phase of the markets, of economies. This is effectively how the economy is kept afloat by this money that is created and filtered into our pockets by the government intentionally. But sounds a bit too good to be true. Of course, there's a downside. We know what the downside is. It robs us of our wealth that's already present in the bank. But what a lot of people don't know is just in the same way that those asset prices, they continue to go up over time. If you look at most reputed established assets, houses, gold, stocks, big stocks, things like the S&P 500, big indexes, because most of that money that's created, it winds up in stocks rather than winds up in day-to-day life. That means that those prices increase more quickly relative to day-to-day prices in the shop. All right, so it's the concept of the financial economy versus the real economy. So because we know that any money that we put in certain assets over a long enough period of time is pretty much a definite, pretty much guaranteed to go up in price higher than prices, more rapidly than prices in the shop every day do due to inflation. Again, this is something that we can use as an individual philosophy for our investments. And as soon as you know that, you're basically saying that whilst money is still being created, these assets will go up, certain assets will go up with time more quickly compared to prices in the shop, i.e. I can make more money if I invest it rather than just leave it around in cash. Do your own research, of course. I'm just introducing you to the concept tonight. This is one of the things that I learned that made me think, actually, hang on, I need to get savvy to this. I need to start thinking about doing this because this effect is ongoing. This effect is continuous. They've only got two levers that they can pull, interest rates and or money printing. We're going to talk about interest rates now because people hear about interest rates, but they don't really know what they are. The banks can actually use these to mitigate inflation because the higher the interest rates that they have, the less likely people are to lend because they're more likely to stash their money in the Bank of England where they can get a juicy interest rate. Therefore, the less money there is floating around in the economy. Does anyone's head hurt yet? Or are you still following me? By the way, I'm here for Q&As at the end if you want to understand this stuff. But this is a crash course. This is more in depth than any financial advisor will ever give you. And you know what? Without blowing my own trumpet, I've talked to a lot of them. A lot of them don't seem to know this stuff. They know how to get you a good mortgage. They know how to get you, decent rates. They know how to invest, to take your ISA money and invest it. But they don't actually know this stuff. It's crazy. So anyway, you're going to be way more equipped than a lot of people who are actually within the financial world by the end of this webinar. These are the best lessons that I learned through reading, spending a lot of time learning about money. Anyway, back to the subject at hand, interest. Can think of interest rates as returns on your money per annum, calculated as a percentage. Simple interest versus compounded interest. Compounded interest is the exciting one. Einstein's eighth wonder of the world. In this particular example, we're talking about interest with regards to not interest rates. We're just talking purely about interest at this point, and then we're going to build on that with what interest rates are. Does anyone actually know what the Bank of England interest rate means when they adjust it up or down? The Bank of England interest rate is the amount of interest they will give a bank who deposits in the Bank of England. The bank that deposits some capital in the Bank of England, that is the interest rate that they give those banks. Okay? So if they put the interest rate up, banks are more likely to put their money in the Bank of England in a safe somewhere, and so that they can't get it, and it just let it dwell there and accumulate interest. If the interest rates are lower, they're less likely to do that. They're more likely to take on something slightly more risky, like lend their money to other people, to go out into the world and try to create more capital by lending it to others. So what does that mean? If the Bank of England interest rate increases, then as I say, banks are more likely to deposit their cash in the Bank of England. Also, banks will raise the interest rates if they offer customers savings to reflect this. This can only go so low. After that, if the economy needs more stimulus, then their options become limited, and they're certainly a lot more likely to print money at that point. Remember, negative interest rates are something that's being chucked around at this point. How insane is that? You get penalized if you leave your money in your bank account. Now, I'm not saying go and spend all your money, go and invest all of your money. You need that cash cushion. That's going to look different for everybody. I can never give everybody financial advice. All I can say is I can say plant the seed, and I can say these are the things that the government, people in power are using against us all and taking advantage of their authority, of their knowledge, on our lack of knowledge. If we equip ourselves with an understanding of what this is, then we're so much more able to go out into the real world and defend ourselves, defend our wealth. And this is why I started the group, basically. People don't know this stuff. Quantitative easing, create money on computers out of nothing. That's just the money printing I was talking about earlier. That is the fancy term for it. Basically, the only way out of this current massive debt situation without using deflationary measures. Remember, they don't like deflationary measures, okay? They like inflationary measures to keep the economy going. The trouble is you can only do that for so long. You can only print so much money until money becomes worthless. And this can lead to inflation via increased money supply. You'll notice I've used the word can there, because it's actually a slightly more complex than that. Just when you thought you were beginning to understand things, actually there's a few more layers to it. And I didn't mention this earlier because I would have made it too complex at that point. But we're going to delve into that in just a second. When you read, there are lots of great books on finance out there. They will give you a very simple narrative. I won't name any names, but there's one that's chucked around on the group a lot. And whilst it's a really great book, it doesn't actually give you this more nuanced, in-depth understanding of how economies work and how governments manage their debt. And to understand this, we need to understand two concepts: capital versus credit. So capital is currency that finds its way into the economy via currency printing. So when the Fed turns on its printing presses and the government acquire currency because they sell their bonds, and that money filters into the economy via government spending, however it filters into the economy, that is capital. And there's actually a slight difference. Credit is money that is lent into existence. So a lot of people don't know this happens. Not all money creation happens in the Fed or the Bank of England. It actually happens because that power is divested to individual banks via something called, before we get into what it's called, just remember that 90% of American dollars are in fact credit. This is how powerful this effect is. 90%, 9 out of every $10 are not even created by the Fed. They're created by fractional reserve banking. You might have heard this term, but no one is, maybe you've not really had a chance to look up what it is. We're going to explain what it is tonight. Very simply, of course, because I've chucked a lot at everyone tonight. I hope everybody's still awake and still enjoying it. But this is the sort of stuff that it's so interesting to just lay this foundation tonight before you can begin learning more and more and more. And remember, anything you don't know, just feel free to ask me a question at the end. What is fractional reserve banking? This is something that sounds like it should be illegal, but it is actually legal. When a bank any old bank, Santander, Halifax, any bank, wants to lend money, it only needs to have 10% of the money that it lends in its actual reserves. All right. So if a bank has £100,000 in reserve, it can lend £1 million to other people. Okay. So that money, that 900,000, that basically just got created out of thin air. That's what happened. It was lent into existence. All right. Now, obviously, the more currency that's created, the more of this money that's being lent, the more people that borrow, the more credit there is, the more inflation there is as well. So it's not just from money printing, it's from credit creation too. So this is also going on. And this is managed with interest rates because the banks are more likely to lend if interest rates are lower. So this is what the Bank of England effectively do when they want to manage how much inflation there is in society. They increase their interest rates. At the minute, they want there to be lending because the economy is slowing down a lot. They need there to be more credit so they can get it back up and running. They're talking about increasing interest rates again. But they haven't decided definitively what they're going to do just yet. And this can make the whole inflation problem much worse as more money is being created. That currency, that cash that we work so hard for, effectively it's being stolen from under our noses, out of our bank accounts because of these effects. And this brings us on to something a little more interesting. This is short-term debt cycles. So every 5 to 8 years, central banks moderate credit creation by increasing their interest rates. You can think of debt as basically borrowing from your future self. Okay, so every 5 to 8 years, roughly, debts get so big that it starts to stifle the economy. They decrease interest rates so that there's a little bit of stimulus there. Then that cycle basically reverses and it just keeps continuing and continuing and continuing. So the interest rates go up, inflation goes down, interest rates go down, inflation goes up as the economy needs to be stimulated, and also interest rates effectively need to be managed. But that's all well and good. But what happens with time, as we've seen in those previous graphs, what happens with time is that over long periods of time, the government accrues steadily more and more debt. So these short-term debt cycles, they don't fully eradicate the debt problem. They just slow it down and speed it up in various increments, okay? And over time, that debt, overall, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's when we get into something called the long-term debt cycle. This is what happens. Now, you might get a little bit of deja vu when I describe this situation. A long-term debt cycle, the end of the long-term debt cycle is when interest rates become so low that there's still not enough credit in the economy. There's still not enough credit that's out there that's being created to stimulate the economy. Government debt is so big that they spend so much money managing it that interest rates won't help them. Interest rates can't inflate away their problems, so they have to create money. Okay, and that's effectively what it is. It stifles the economy. There's nowhere to go. They have to print money. Inevitably, there's too much. Inevitably, there's hyperinflation because they can't change those interest rates at that point. And that's the situation we are in at the minute. This is the United States debt burden. This is the Bank of England base rate. This is a few years behind, but at the minute, as we all know very, very, very well, it's at 0.01%. So the government can't stimulate the economy in any other way. It's throwing everything it has at it. And its debt burden is already unmanageable. How is it going to get out? Well, it remains to be seen. Certainly there's an easy way that's dangling in front of itself. And that debt, if they can inflate it away to nothing, that's certainly in their interest. But is it in our interest? That is entirely another kettle of fish. What happens next? This is the deleveraging phase. This is the end of a long-term debt cycle. So remember, as debt rises, the government gets choked, it gets stifled, it can't spend, incomes fall, borrowers get squeezed because people that owe money, their debts are recalled by banks because they need money. They sell their assets to cover their debt and assets tank. You know when everyone gets so anxious when the stock market crashes? This is why, because it's a self-perpetuating cycle. As soon as people appear less creditworthy, they can borrow less money. As soon as they can borrow less money, they can buy less things. As soon as they buy less things, more people lose their job. They become poorer. they can buy less assets, their debt rises, and so you see what I mean. The cycle continues, and this is why the government has to step in, and this is why it does step in. It's for its own good, and it's for the good of us all. How does it do that? Creating money. Remember the 4 methods the government uses to reduce government debt. If it can balance these deflationary methods with the inflationary methods, remember there's 3 deflationary methods that cause there to be less money in the economy. There's one inflationary method. If it can get these 4 things right, then it isn't all doom and gloom. It may not be the end of the world. It may not be the case that we have rampant inflation. It may not be possible, but remember, you're putting quite a lot of faith in the government there. Do they always get it right? Definitely not. Are they a lot better at getting it right these days than they were in Roman times, than they were in any other time in history, in the Yuan dynasty, in the Weimar Republic, all of those things? No, they're not. They're not necessarily, they may well be better at managing their money. They may well be better at that, but no, we're not the same. We're the same old people. We're the same old people, okay? There is the chance that this could go very badly wrong. If it does, then what will result is our money will go through the roof in value. Our money will will decrease through the floor in value, I beg your pardon, and it'll be worth so much less to us. And this is why we have to begin to think about how we can protect our wealth, protect our assets, and ensure that we have a store of value going forwards. How interesting is that? Effectively, that is in a nutshell how the economy works. I hope everybody's still with me. I hope everybody learned a lot from that. It's a lot to get your head around. You might have to watch that again, but this is why it's so, so, so important to begin to think about these things. So it's very, very, very easy. I know I said it earlier on in this lecture, but I only said it just so that I didn't confuse things too much earlier. Money printing equals bad. That's what we're all told. But actually, everyone knows on here now that they're way more savvy than that. When it comes to the end of those long-term debt cycles, we don't have interest rates to bail us out. But what we do have is the 4 ways the government can reduce their debt. They have to get it right. They have to keep all these 4 things in check. They can't decrease spending too much. They can't reduce their debts too much. They can't increase tax too much. They can't print too much money. They can't do all of those things. But why are we going to put all our faith in someone else? And we've actually got 2 governments we have to worry about. We have to worry about the British government doing it right, and we have to worry about the American government doing it right. So, the odds get ever slimmer. The odds get ever slimmer. And as I say, of course, it's not that simple. If governments get the right balance of inflationary and deflationary measures, they can deleverage the economy harmoniously. What I mean by deleverage is they can reduce debt burdens. They can reduce that amount of debt that they owe. They might have to increase taxes. They might have to go to those banks after all, and they might have to say, actually, we need less. They might have to reduce spending, and they might have to do a little bit of money printing as well. But like I said, we have to bear in mind that they are way more tempted to print money than do anything else because of how simple it is to solve those problems via doing that. And that is why everybody gets so upset. Everybody gets so they concentrate on money printing. That is why everybody talks about it so much. But what they don't talk about is how it isn't always doom and gloom. It isn't always possible that might result in rampant hyperinflation. It may not be the case, but why would we put all our eggs in one basket by holding cash? Why would we do that? Remember, most things in life, you have to spread your risk, and certainly how we think about our money is another instance, another example of that effectively. And this is the philosophy that I take into investing and that I want to instill in anybody who comes on this journey with me. And like I say, people just don't seem to know this stuff. This is why I wanted to create the course. This is why I wanted to share this knowledge. I hope that everybody's come away tonight with an improved understanding of the economy, a more in-depth understanding, and maybe they'll have had a few wow moments as that lecture went on, particularly for me, about the Fed. That is the one thing that I think is truly scandalous. And remember, there are ways that we can hedge ourselves against inflation. These include buying stocks, commodities, bonds, and of course, Bitcoin, the anti-deflationary asset, which is designed to go up in value. It's literally designed to be anti-inflationary, a hedge against inflation. You will see why that is in subsequent lectures. But this is the reason why people get so passionate about Bitcoin. It's not an asset that can be stolen by the government like gold. It's something that you own, no one else owns. It's a peer-to-peer means of transferring value, and that's why people get so passionate when they talk about it. The problem is, the essence of the problem is, we as a species have an inclination to borrow and spend more than we can afford to pay back. This is why debt cycles happen. It's because we can't be trusted on the whole to actually repay our debts. It's too tempting for us to be able to spend more in the short term. It's too tempting for us to do that, and we find it hard to manage our money as a species. It's the whole reason why the credit card industry exists effectively, and this is why, until human psychology changes, there will always be debt cycles. Real world examples where the end of the deleveraging phase occurred, the end of the long-term debt cycle occurred, that is, the American Great Depression actually started because of that. Japanese economy in the 1980s, it's never actually recovered since then. They've had stagflation ever since then. They've had really high inflation and poor growth of their economy. It's not really somewhere you want to hold. That's why the yen is so, we can exchange quite a lot of yen for our pounds and our dollars. That's why that's the case. That's why 1,000 yen is, I don't even know what the exchange rate is, but it's very low, maybe about 10p, 15p. Once upon a time, 1,000 yen would have bought you a lot more. We talked about hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. This is an actual note. Someone from the group sent me this: 10 million Zimbabwean dollars. This is the note that necessitated printing because of rampant hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. This can, and it does happen. This is happening to this day. History proves that this is the downfall of empires. Will this time be different? Possibly. But why don't we spread our risk, and why don't we think about doing some investing? Think about spreading it across different assets, figuring out what those are, identifying them, and taking advantage of this in those inherent effects. The retail economy, the everyday economy, and the financial economy, that concept, once you know that, you already have an amazing basis. And as soon as you accept that money printing will continue, that debt cycles will continue, and that the world population is going to keep increasing, you already accept that lots of assets are good long-term investments. It's just about playing that long game and identifying those assets. Gold is the original form of money. Gold is best. Gold is the OG. Gold is the yardstick by which inflation is actually measured. Gold, remember, the main thing that drives the value of gold is consensus. It's because we think it looks beautiful. We've deconstructed in our heads why something can have value. Ask yourself this on a philosophical level. The value of gold is largely attributed to the fact that we all think it has a value, just like many things in life. Just like anything has a value because we think it does. Just different assets, of the value of different assets, the likelihood that that's ascribed to a perception of value for each one increases and decreases, depends on the asset. And I would argue for gold, it's very much increased. So it's possible that anything can have a value. We just have to believe that it does. Enough people just have to think that it does. And then all of a sudden, when we start thinking about crypto, things start to make a lot more sense. Here we go. Thank you so much for listening.